Jerusalem here, if you'll remember, let me turn this gizmo on. Jerusalem is in disrepair. Jerusalem, the city's in disrepair. Nehemiah has gotten word that the city's in disrepair. Remember that Nehemiah is in Susa, Shushan, which is a 900-mile distance from Jerusalem. He's there at the capital of the Persian Empire with the king Artaxerxes. So Nehemiah finds out that the walls are in disrepair. The king finds out that Nehemiah is saddened of heart, and the king asks Nehemiah, "What's wrong? You've never been sad in my presence before." And we saw that Nehemiah prayed to the Lord. Look what it says in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4. "Then the king said to me, 'What would you request?'" So Nehemiah tells the king that my city, the cities where my forefathers have been entombed, the burial sites of my forefathers are in shambles. The city is in disrepair. I would like to do something about that. The king says, "What would you like to do?" And the very first thing we see Nehemiah do, it says, "So I prayed to the God of heaven." Even before he would answer a simple question, "What is your request?" he prayed to God. Everything that in this Nehemiah's life is bathed in prayer. In verse 5, after praying to the Lord, remember there was a 4-month period. There was a 4-month period between Nehemiah getting the information from his brother and his brother's friends who had traveled from Judah and Jerusalem. 4 months had gone by before he got back into the presence of the king, at least until the king asked him this question. 4 months Nehemiah has been praying, preparing for this very moment, and now the moment is here. And one last time Nehemiah prays to the Lord before he speaks to the king. "I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant," speaking of himself in the third person, "if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Now remember last time we talked about the fact that 71 years had gone by since the temple had been rebuilt. Jerusalem's already gone into Babylon. They've done their 70 years in Babylon. They've moved back into the land of Jerusalem, the land of Judah, the city of Jerusalem. The temple's been up since 515 BC. 71 years has gone by. It started, the city, the walls and the gates of the city started to be rebuilt even then. But there was a king who stopped the building of the city of Jerusalem. And you remember who that king is. It's the very same king here, Artaxerxes, the one we see depicted in the painting on the wall there on the screen. It's this same king Artaxerxes who said, "Ezra, I want you to go back and rebuild the worship at the temple. I want you to get worship going again." A few years go by, this very same king here, he's getting pressure from some Gentiles as the city's being rebuilt. So once he's friendly to Jerusalem and the Jews, and the very next time he makes a decree, it's anti-Israel, anti-Jerusalem, and he says, "Stop the building of this rebellious city." Only 2 years have gone by since his decree stopped the building, and here Nehemiah is before him in 444 BC. And Nehemiah tells the king, "I want to rebuild the city. I want to start, king, what you decreed to stop. I want to start it again." And as we saw, Artaxerxes had such a respect for his cupbearer Nehemiah that he had no hesitation in granting this wish to Nehemiah. Only 2 years had gone by. The Jews in Jerusalem were seen as a rebellious and evil people, but the relationship that this leader Nehemiah had before this king, the integrity that he showed, the character that he showed, made the king without question say, "If you say it's a good thing, let's go do it." Astounding. And then we saw that Nehemiah would ask for things. It says in verse 6, "The king said to me," as he is giving Nehemiah permission to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild it, the king has a question, the queen sitting beside him. You see that in the picture here. And the king's question is, "How long will you be gone? How long will your journey be?" Remember the 900-mile distance. "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" And this Nehemiah had been planning, he'd been thinking, praying about this moment. He has an answer. He said, so it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And we're going to go over some leadership qualities that Nehemiah showed in a little bit. But Nehemiah had planned ahead. He knew how to answer the king. How long will it take to rebuild the walls? He had an idea. He had an idea of how long it would take. In verse 9, drop your eyes down to verse 9 with me. It says, then I came to the governors. Remember, Nehemiah didn't only say, I want to go rebuild the walls. But after that, he said, not only do I want you to send me back, king, but I want you to give me letters of protection so that I can travel the 900 miles west and not be bothered. And then he didn't only stop there, but remember, he also asked for Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, to be able to give the Jews lumber, timbers, so they could rebuild the walls, the gates, and the city of Jerusalem. A bold leader, this Jewish man Nehemiah. And the king gave him everything he wanted. In verse 9, Nehemiah is on his journey. It says, then I came to the governors. I came to the governors of the provinces beyond the river. He's beyond the Euphrates River. He's traveling west, and look what he finds. It says here, I gave the governors the king's letters, the letters of protection. And it says, now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. What a man this Nehemiah must have been, that King Artaxerxes, after 2 years ago saying, we have to stop building this city, now to say, not only am I going to build it, not only am I going to fund it by giving you the timbers to rebuild it, I'm going to send a portion of the army with you to protect you. That's who Nehemiah was to King Artaxerxes. But the governors of the provinces got hold of these letters of protection, and look what it says in verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, remember the Ammonites are east of Israel, what we would call modern day Jordan. Tobiah the Ammonite official, when they heard about it, that the king of Persia had given protection to this Jew, they were incensed. Look what it says. It was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. Anti-Semitism, plain and simple. Jewish hatred is what we're seeing here. It displeased them that the king of Persia wrote letters of protection for their travel, and that someone was going back into Judah seeking good for the people of Israel. I'll only say that enemies are never far behind when good things are happening to Israel. And here we are, Nehemiah hasn't even reached Jerusalem yet, and already Satan has his men on the road trying to stop things, displeased with what's going on. He makes the 900-mile trip in verse 11. He gets there, so I came to Jerusalem. I made it with letters of protection from my friend the king. I made it to Jerusalem, and I was there for 3 days. What was he doing for 3 days? Nehemiah, the great leader of men, Nehemiah. Let's read a little bit more and maybe start figuring out what he could have been doing in these 3 days. We know Nehemiah is a prayer. He prays, is what I mean by that. He prays to God consistently. We know that he's a planner, a gatherer of facts. When the king said, what would be your request? He knew who Asaph was, the keeper of the king's forest. He had learned all these things. He gathered these facts. He knew exactly what he needed to ask. When the king said, how long will you be gone? He gave him an answer. This is how long it'll take me to do this job. He's a planner. He's a gatherer of facts. So in these 3 days, we can imagine that Nehemiah was at least praying to Yahweh, gathering facts, and finding men he could trust. Finding Jewish men who he could trust to go on a recon mission with him and not speak a word of it to anyone. It took him 3 days to find those men. Look what it says in verse 12. I arose in the night after 3 days. I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. Careful consideration of men that he could trust. The men of Israel know nothing yet. Nehemiah has chosen a few good men to go with him. He says, I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem. Having an ongoing prayer life with God as God is deepening, I like to say, I stole it from another pastor, deepening mental impressions. We think sometimes, how is it that God gets us to do things when He wants us to do them? And I heard a pastor once use the phrase, He deepens our mental impressions. And I love that because that's what He does. More and more you think, oh, you just circumstance, things pile up. You realize this is the good time to do this, the right time that God makes the money available, He makes the vehicle or whatever available, and He just continues to deepen your mental impressions that He must want me to do this because look at everything He's stacked. Look at all the dominoes He has set up. It must be the time to do this. And that's what's happening in Nehemiah's walk with the Lord. He said, I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind. Deepening his mentality, his mental impressions about the plan and the will of God. God was working with Nehemiah to do a good thing for Jerusalem. He said, there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So he's got one animal, a horse or mule, donkey, whatever he's riding. He's got a few men with him. And he goes on a nighttime reconnaissance mission. Verse 13, he's gathering facts. He's planning. So I went out by night. I went out by the valley gate in the direction of the dragon's well. I'll show you a picture of some of these gates in a minute. I went out at night by the valley gate. Remember, the gates are torn down. The gates are all broken. The wall is in disrepair. That's why Nehemiah is going back to rebuild the walls and the gates. So he's looking at his job. I went out at night by the valley gate, the direction of the dragon's well, and on to the refuse gate, the dung gate. The dung gate still exists in Jerusalem. Inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down. Inspecting its gates, which were consumed by fire. He is making a plan, prayerfully going around the city, getting the scope of work, trying to find out what numbers of timbers he will need. All these things, this man is making a plan as he prayerfully walks around this city. Verse 14, it says, Then I passed on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool. Remember the disrepair of the walls, the rubble. It says, But there was no place for my animal to pass. It was an impassable part, so he had to turn around. So in verse 15, he took an alternate route. It says, So I went up at night by the ravine, and I inspected the wall. I couldn't get close enough to the wall. I had to go through the ravine. Maybe the Kidron Valley is the side of that they're on here. And then I entered the valley gate again and returned. So in modern Jerusalem, this is what these things look like. I don't know that they would have looked vastly different than this then. They've been destroyed, they've been covered up, they've been rebuilt several times in Jerusalem's history. But in 70 AD, when Titus, the Roman, came through and destroyed the temple, most of these temple walls, not temple walls, but city walls remained up. That wall on the east is the gate on the left, I should say, is the East Gate or the Golden Gate. It's the most famous gate in Israel. You know why? Why, Gail?
Because the Muslim world put their graveyards there, so
Because this is the gate that Jesus, the Messiah, will walk through when he walks triumphantly into the Temple Mount the very next time. And the Muslims have closed off this gate, and you can see there that they have buried their dead there, because certainly a God can't pass over death and become unclean. And so by walling off the gate and putting a cemetery there, they assume that the Christian Messiah won't ever be able to pass that way again. He's going to pass that way again. He'll walk right through that eastern gate. One day we will see it happen because we'll be with him. when he returns at the second coming, at his second coming, not the rapture, but the second coming 7 years later, his feet will step down on the Mount of Olives. If you could imagine the land coming towards us is the Kidron Valley, we would be standing on the Mount of Olives looking across. If you could see what's on the top of that gate, you'd see the Dome of the Rock, where the Muslims have that atrocious shrine to their false god Allah there. That's what's just above that eastern gate. But when Jesus comes back, according to Zechariah 14:4, his feet will hit the Mount of Olives, split the Kidron Valley greater than it's ever been, and he will walk through that gate. In Ezekiel, it says that when the Shekinah glory, I'm getting off here, but these are interesting facts, that presence of God above the mercy seat, the cloud, the pillar of cloud, when Jerusalem was about to be destroyed and God left Jerusalem, when he left the temple, the Holy of Holies, when the cloud was taken up and moved away from Israel, away from Jerusalem, it went towards the east. It says it went to the eastern door of the temple, and then it went to the eastern gate, and you're looking at it right there on the left, and then it proceeded to the east, which makes some scholars think that the heavens, that the third heaven is toward the east as you look out at the sky. Because the Bible also says that he will return from the east. And so he will go through that gate at the second coming, sometime after the Battle of Armageddon, after these things have taken place. He's freed the Druze from Petra, and he comes down to attack the city, to attack the nations that are trying to destroy Jerusalem. He'll kill all of them, and then he will triumphantly enter that gate. And we get to see it. And I can't wait. It'll be the same wall, the same gate that you're looking at in that picture. Nothing will change. This event could happen 7 years from tonight. The rapture could happen today. 7 years from now, we're going through that gate. So be it. You Muslims. Yeah, walked right up to it. So different gates, simply different gates. I believe this gate on the left is the Dung Gate that's still there on the southeastern side of the city. Different gates. This is what Nehemiah was looking at. These are the things that Nehemiah had to rebuild. He needed wood for the inner structure. He needed brick, mortar, all of these things. And on this recon mission with this few men that he had chosen, these are the gates he was looking at as he went around the city. Maybe not these exact gates, don't get me wrong. But gates just like these going into the city of Jerusalem. They surround the city of Jerusalem. Two different gates here, or two different maps, because I don't know whether you know or not, but Jerusalem, the city, has changed several times over the years, and the gates, the walls, of the city have changed where they are. I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. But here you have what Nehemiah said. I left the valley gate. I went to the refuse gate. I went around to the fountain gate and the king's pool. There was no room for my steed to go, my mount to go. So I went down the ravine and I checked out the rest of the gates from the ravine, probably down here at a distance looking at what he could see. And then he went back around and re-entered the valley gate. That's what the Bible just said. That's what we just read. Here's an interesting thought. When Jesus was crucified, it was right here. But when Jesus was crucified, this is a recent discovery within the last, 40 or 50 years, a very, very important discovery. When you read in the Old Testament about the death of Messiah, it says that he would be crucified outside the city walls. You can't crucify the Messiah. You can't crucify anyone inside the city of Jerusalem, or it will make the city unclean. And remember, he was killed on Passover. The city needed to be clean so they could worship God in the Passover. Well, for a long time, where they thought Golgotha was, it was a problem because the city wall, the existing city wall, goes outside of where Golgotha should be. You understand my point? And if Golgotha is right there, that can't be, the place of the skull where Jesus was crucified, if that's the proper place, it has to be the wrong place because of the walls of the city. It would be inside the walls of the city. You see that, right? That red dot is inside the walls of the city. But if the city looked more like this in the days of Jesus, if the walls were a smaller footprint than they are now, then Golgotha would have been outside of the city. Now I'll tell you about the archaeological find. In the downstairs of one of the Russian Orthodox churches there in Jerusalem, and we saw this place, they found a needle of the eye of a needle. They found one of these small places. It's about that wide, about this tall. A man would have to duck down to get into the city walls. A soldier with his armor on could never go through that. Certainly a soldier on a horse could never pass through that eye of the needle. They found one of these and they thought, how interesting, this is wonderful. They started excavating around it, and what they also found was an old wall foundation. They found the foundation of the ancient walls of Jerusalem and realized, if this is where the ancient wall is, then the Golgotha site that we know of can be the Golgotha site, because it's outside of the walls that once existed here. Archaeology, friends, is one of God's. He uses archaeology a lot to prove the Bible. Just an aside, I find it interesting. I hope you did too. Wonderful thing, Jesus was buried crucified outside the city gates, the city walls, but the walls have changed shapes several times. But we know now that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they say Jesus was crucified, is a proper spot. Anyway, I digress. The city walls of Jerusalem. We could talk all day about Jerusalem and Old Jerusalem and what it was. But what we see here is that as soon as Nehemiah started looking around, people started saying, you can't do this. They didn't like it. Look what it says in verse 16. The officials did not know where I had gone. It's a secret, it's a recon mission, a secret mission. No one knew where he had gone except him and the 5 or the few men that he could trust. So the officials didn't know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews. The officials are the Persians, the people that are running for the Persian Empire, the city. But Nehemiah had not told them, and he'd also not told his fellow Jews that his plan was to rebuild the walls and the gates. He hadn't told the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. He had not said a word about it. He would not involve, one of the greatnesses of Nehemiah, he would not involve anyone else until he knew every facet of the work and how it could successfully be completed. He's not spitballing here with a bunch of guys. He's got a very few men that he's chosen to trust, and he is coming up with the plan for the rebuilding of the walls, prayerfully going around the city, inspecting the condition of the walls of the city, allowing God to deepen his mental impressions. Where should I start, Lord? Should I start here? Should I start over here? How should it all be done at the same time? I'm pleading with the Lord, I'm sure, for direction in how to do this. Verse 17. Then, big word, then. Only when I had formulated a successful plan. That's what leaders do. Only then I said to them, the people, the men of the city, the priests, the nobles, the officials, his fellow Jews. He said, you see the bad situation we're in, that Jerusalem is desolate. It's broken down. Its gates are burned by fire. Come, Nehemiah says, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we will no longer be a reproach. And then he brings in Yahweh. He says, I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me. I'm sure he told him of his brother Hanani coming and his friends all the way to Susa, the capital. He told them what he had told them. He told them about the 4 months of fervent prayer. He told them how he was the cupbearer to the king. I'm sure he told them that before the king, he pled his case that the place where my father's graves are is in disrepair. I want to go back and rebuild the city. I'm sure he told them about the letters of protection, told them about the Asaph, the forest keeper, giving him the lumber that he needs, all the timber. They knew the story. He gave them all the facts they needed to make a decision. Can we follow this man and do this or not? And he was the kind of leader that as soon as he pled his case, they said, we're in. I mean, all the chips, buddy. We're in. You've got the backing of Yahweh our God. He has sent you to do these things. The story that you tell is wonderful. God is in control of this. We will build. I told him how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. And then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. Remember, these are Jews that 2 years earlier, 700 days, we're not talking about a long period of time, 2 years earlier, they had been forced by this same king, you stop building this city. And now all of a sudden Nehemiah shows up and they believe every word he says, and they start building this city. They take up the tools to build the city. They are confident that if God is behind this, they can do it. They say, let us arise and build this city. Verse 19. But, because Satan never wants Jerusalem to have peace. A city without a wall was unsafe, easy to attack. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, here we go again with these people, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, and a third is added, an Arab, and Geshem, the Arab, heard it. Any lost love between the Jews and the Arabs? Not even in 480 BC, 444 BC, alive and well. What did they do? They mocked us. They mocked us and despised us. And they hurled the insult. What is this thing that you are doing? You are rebelling against the king. Are you rebelling against the king? They don't want a free Jerusalem. They don't want a safe Jerusalem. They want it kept just the way it is. And so what does Nehemiah say? Does he bow up? Does he get angry? Does he beat men up? Does he cuss them? What does the great Jewish leader Nehemiah do? Going to learn a lot from this man, gentlemen. I answered them and I said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. I come in the name of God. Your insults, your slurs, your mocking have no effect on me. I'm not going to go down to your level. I've come in the name of God to do the work of God. God will protect and provide. And I'm not about to do anything that makes me have anything to be blamed for. The God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. He wasn't stopped in the least, wasn't intimidated one drop. We're going to start building as soon as I say so. That's what we're going to do because God says we can. We, his servants, will arise and build, but you have, listen to what he tells these men. He tells a Horonite, an Ammonite, and an Arab these things. You have no portion, no right, and no memorial in Jerusalem. And man, I wish people would memorize that verse right there. For all these people, you know, Jerusalem wasn't freed until I think the 1967 or 74 war. Before that, the temple where God was worshipped, where God dwelled among his people Israel, the Temple Mount was under the control of Muslim Arabs until like 50 years ago. 50, not 500, not 1,500, 50 years ago. Jerusalem has always been the center of attack. And not until I think it was 70 war, actually, but it may be 67, did Jerusalem or did Israel, the Jews, finally take over, at least have the right to worship at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, and those things? This is very recent. So it says here, Nehemiah tells them, you have no portion. And what he means by that is you people, you Hormonites, you Ammonites, you Arabs, you have no current share or claim to this city. This city is not yours today. And then he says, and you have no right or memorial in it. Not only do you not have a claim in this city today, you've never had a claim in this city. You don't have a current claim. You don't have a past historical claim. This city has always belonged to Israel since King David took it over from the Jebusites, and we're here to take it back. We will rebuild the walls regardless of who you think you are. A leader, Nehemiah. Some quick verses. Look at Nehemiah chapter 3. He tells these people, you have no right. This city belongs to God and His chosen people, Israel. And we're going to rebuild the walls. In Nehemiah chapter 3, just look at some of the gates. Follow along on the chart there. It says, then Eliashib, the high priest, arose. Look at who's building the wall. The priests are building. The common people are building. Everybody has their hands involved in rebuilding the walls of God's city, Jerusalem. So what does it say? Eliashib, the high priest, arose. The high priest of Israel, rebuilding a wall. With his brothers, the priests, they built the sheep gate up here. They built the sheep gate, they consecrated, they hung its doors, they consecrated the wall to the Tower of the 100. I want you to go to verse 3. The sons of Hashanah built the fish gate. All these things are going on at once. I forget the actual amount of time. I could look forward a chapter and see, but it's like 78 days. It's an unbelievably short time in which the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt, because this man had a plan and worked the plan perfectly. The fish gate, if you drop down to verse 6, Jehoiada, the son of Paseah, Meshullam, the son of Beshalot, whatever that is, Besadiah, repaired the old gate. You can just keep going around from west or from east to west there. And now we're going around the south side. They laid its beams, they hung its doors. Who funded this? King Artaxerxes did. He's the one that gave the letters of protection. He's the one that says, get the lumber, get any timber you need from Asaph, the keeper of the forest. The Gentile Artaxerxes, the one who 2 years earlier said, stop rebuilding the walls, he funded this. You go on here, that's the old gate. In verse 8, it says, next to him, Hananiah, one of the perfumers. All types of people, all walks of life, stopped what they were doing to rebuild this gate, to rebuild the city walls. So the perfumers made repairs, and they restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall, or the broad wall. Look at verse 12. For all the ladies in the crowd. Next to him, Shallum, the son of Halohesh, the official of half the district of Jerusalem, made repairs. He and his daughters. It wasn't just men out there. It was Jew. It was side by side. Old Jew, young Jew, male Jew, female Jew. They knew they had Yahweh's backing. They had a leader in Nehemiah they could follow, and they built the wall. All of them did. Fascinating, unified event that took place here. Verse 13, they repaired the valley gate. Look, as you go around, this is the gate that Nehemiah had gone out and come back in during his recon mission. At the end of 13, it says they rebuilt the refuse gate, the dung gate. If you look down to verse 15, it says they repaired the fountain gate. At different times in Israel's history, there have been more gates or fewer gates around the city of Jerusalem. These are the gates that were there in Nehemiah's day, 444 BC. In verse 26, the temple servants living in the Ophel, everybody was building the walls. I'm trying to say it wasn't just the masons, it wasn't just the carpenters. Everybody was helping rebuild God's city, the city of Jerusalem. The temple servants living in Ophel made repairs as far as the front of the water gate toward the east and projecting tower. If you look at verse 28, it says, above the horse gate, the priests carried out repairs. Everybody was working. Verse 29, it says, after them Zadok the son of Emer carried out repairs in front of his house. This is how we know where the priests lived in Israel, or in the city of Old Jerusalem, based on some of these statements like this. If the gate is near where his house was, then we know where the priests and the high priest lived. Important when you get to the days of Jesus, and Jesus goes to the house of Annas and the house of Caiaphas on that night he's arrested. We know where that was. We have an idea in the city where that would have been. So it says, he carried out repairs in front of his house, and after him Shemaiah and the son of Shechaniah, the keeper of the east gate, carried out repairs. There's the great gate, the gate that Jesus will walk in one day. In verse 31, it says the inspection gate. The inspection gate was repaired. And in verse 32, we're back to the sheep gate. Between the upper room of the corner and the sheep gate, look who helped here, the goldsmiths and the merchants. If you go through that, chapter 3, and pick out all the people that helped, it was every walk of life in Jerusalem. Everybody stopped what they were doing to follow this leader Nehemiah to rebuild this city. The goldsmiths and the merchants, everybody, they carried out the repairs. Now before we finish, I want to show you some things here. I take these are not mine, I didn't compile this list. In the book Nehemiah, Man in Charge, a man named Donald Campbell compiled a list of 21 characteristics of a leader, of the leader Nehemiah. I just want to share them with you. 21 characteristics necessary for effective leadership. Look at what they are. Who was this man Nehemiah? He established a reasonable and attainable goal. We could talk about all these, but we won't. It's getting late. He established a reasonable and attainable goal. He let King Artaxerxes know, this is the time period I need to be gone. I need protection. I need some timbers. Make it happen. And the king did it. He established a reasonable and attainable goal. I'm going back to rebuild the walls and the gates. He didn't talk about building palaces. He didn't go beyond what he needed to do. He fortified the city. Number 2, he had a sense of mission. He prayed to God. He knew that he knew what he wanted to do. He and his prayer to the Lord was opening up this deepening mental impression. He had a sense of mission. He knew that Jerusalem was God's city. We read that in Nehemiah chapter 1. Number 3, he was willing to get involved. On that day, the king Artaxerxes said, hey, cupbearer, what's wrong with you? Why are you sad? I know you're not sick. This is a heart sadness. Why are you distressed? Nehemiah could have blown it off, said, you know, king, my stomach hurts, but I'll be fine. But he didn't. He had the boldness before Artaxerxes, again, the man who 2 years earlier said, stop rebuilding that evil and rebellious city. He had the courage to say to the king, I want to rebuild Jerusalem. He was willing to get involved. He put his head in a noose. He rearranged his priorities in order to accomplish his goal. He arranged his personal priorities, whatever they were. He rearranged them in order to make a 900-mile unpleasant trip to go rebuild the city of Jerusalem. He patiently waited for God's timing. Remember, for 4 months, he was the cupbearer. Daily, he would have come to King Artaxerxes with his cup, with his beverage. Several times a day, Artaxerxes and Nehemiah were in contact over that 4-month period between Hanani telling Nehemiah the city's broken down and him finally getting the option or the being able to tell the king what was wrong. 4 months went by. He patiently waited for God's timing, and finally God opened the door when Artaxerxes said, "What's wrong with you?" Number 6, he showed respect to his superior. Long live the king, if it pleased the king. Number 7, he prayed at crucial times. The king said, "What is your request?" What's the first thing Nehemiah did? He prayed to the Lord his God. He prayed at crucial times. He didn't rely on, we've been talking to the Lord, you've given me this, my mental impressions, I know what I want to do. Even before he speaks to Nehemiah, after 4 months of praying to the Lord, he prayed again. He prayed at crucial times. Leaders pray. Leaders pray. Number 8, he made his request with tact and graciousness. He was very careful how he spoke to the king. Tactful, gracious. I'll give you these later if you want them. I'll even print them for you. Number 9, he was or I can email or text them to you. He was well prepared, and he thought of his needs in advance. He was a planner. A leader plans things. And he was well thought out. When the king said, "How long do you need? How long will your journey be? When will you return?" He had an answer in advance. He knew these things. Well-prepared man. Number 10, he went through proper channels. He didn't wait. He waited for the king to address him. He went through the proper channels of asking the king for the letters of protection. He went to the king to ask if he could take timber from the Asaph's forest. He went through proper channels. Number 11, he took time, 3 days. He rested, he prayed, he planned, as we talked about. I made it to Jerusalem and I was there 3 days. And after that, I went on my nighttime recon missions. Took 3 days. He took time. Wasn't in a hurry, wasn't impetuous. He took time to rest and pray and plan. Number 12, he investigated the situation firsthand. His recon mission. I don't want to take anybody's word for it. I want to lay eyes on it. I want to lay eyes on it. That's what leaders do. They take the time to investigate situations firsthand. So many of these things, all of these things are applied to everything we do in the church. To everything we do in life. Number 13, I keep saying verse. He informed others only after he knew the size of the problem. He laid eyes on it. He recognized what work needed to be done. Only when he had formulated a plan, only then did he go and involve anybody else. A very, very small group of men. This isn't democracy where the guy says, "Okay, who's got an idea for how we can rebuild a wall? Anybody know anything about lumber? Anybody know where to get mortar? This is not a democracy. This leader had a very small group of men he worked with to plan this. He informed others only after he knew the size of the problem. It says he didn't tell anybody, not the priests, the leaders, the men of the city. He didn't tell anybody until he was ready to go. Leadership. Why worry people? Oh, he wants to rebuild the walls, but we heard this about Artaxerxes. Why worry people if you don't have a plan? If you don't know you can get it done yet, why worry people? He wouldn't do that. Until he had a plan, he didn't speak. Number 14, he identified himself as one with the people. I've been in contact with the Lord, praying to the Lord. He's deepened my impressions. We can rebuild this wall. He identified himself not as the leader that can't be touched. He worked with the men. He was one of them, didn't put himself above them. Number 15, he set before them a reasonable and attainable goal. Reasonable and attainable goal. Number 16, he assured them God was in the project. He assured them that he had prayerfully gone to the Lord and that God had found favor in Nehemiah and God was favoring Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of the city. He assured them that God was in the project. Number 17, he displayed self-confidence in facing obstacles. What were the names of the obstacles? Sanballat, the Horonite, all the people that came up against him, mocking and insulting. He displayed self-confidence. He didn't bow down to them. He didn't get in a fight. They were trying to pick a fight. He didn't take the bait. He was confident. He knew God was on his side. He knew that historically and even presently, those people had no claim on the city of Jerusalem. This is Jewish land. And his self-confidence, based on his understanding of the truth of Jewish history, is how he faced obstacles. Number 18, it says he displayed God's confidence in facing obstacles. God is with us. He said, what did he say exactly? God will see this through. The God of heaven will give us success. He displayed God's confidence in facing obstacles. Number 19, he did not argue with opponents. He didn't fight them. He knew he was right, and that was good enough for him. Again, Donald Campbell's list, not mine. He didn't argue with his opponents. You have to know which hills to fight on. You can't fight every battle. You've got to choose your battles. Nehemiah knew which battles to choose. It was interesting, by the time they started building this wall, it wasn't a peaceful time. And if you read Nehemiah, as they continued building the wall, the builders would build with one hand and have a weapon in the other hand. A weapon, a war implement, a sword, a spear. Because it wasn't friendly. They didn't get to do this in a friendly way. But even while all this is going on, all Nehemiah, the leader, does is say, this is how we should protect ourselves while we continue the work and get the job done. He didn't argue with his opponents. He was not a fighter. He was a doer. A planner, a doer, an executor. Wonderful man. Number 20, he was not discouraged by opposition. How many of us would have people come and say, you must stop doing this? The king, all we have to do is stir up a little trouble, and we can go back to Artaxerxes and get him to again issue a decree that this is an evil and rebellious city, and we will get this stopped. Didn't faze him at all. The God of heaven will see this wall successfully built. He wasn't discouraged by people that told him, you can't do this. Great leader. And the last one, he courageously used the authority of his position. He courageously, we'd have to read more of the story to flesh that out, but he courageously used the authority of his position. No pushover, but at the same time didn't lord authority over anyone. He was just a great leader. When you read books on biblical leadership, if you go to Google Bible leaders, Nehemiah's name is always going to be at the top of the list. He is the biblical example of leadership in the Bible. He was excellent at what he did. Excellent at making a plan, praying to the Lord about it, seeing the plan, coming up with the proper plan, and executing it, seeing it done. The story of Nehemiah is the best in the book to show a boy how to be a man. Nehemiah knew it. Nehemiah lived it. He's our great example. A little more on Nehemiah next time, because we've got to see this wall completed. We've got to see the wall completed and the gate completed. We'll see that on Wednesday night. Let's close in prayer.